My name is Robert Simels, and this is Injustice for All. This is a show about the failing judicial system, which all of you may read about, hear about, and you would say to yourself, perhaps, why should I listen to this show? What makes it different than any of the other podcasts that exist? The difference is who is heading the podcast, me. And because I have had experiences in the criminal justice system that no one else has. I was a prosecutor. I prosecuted corrupt politicians, corrupt judges, corrupt lawyers, cops, and I made many enemies doing that. I then went into private practice and found out that no one in the establishment that I had been prosecuting for many years wanted to hire me. So I began my own private practice, and it was seemingly going nowhere until one day in May of 1980, a federal judge called me up and asked me to go witness someone signing an agreement to become a witness for the federal government. To make a long story short, in this instance, I went over, I met the person. His name was Henry Hill. Many of you may know that name from the movie Goodfellas. But representing Henry catapulted me in many respects and harmed me in many respects. The mafia was incensed at me, and I lost them as a client base because of representing then the biggest rat in the annals of criminal justice. But Henry's representation launched a different part of my career. First, I was able to sell the idea of Henry's story being a movie, and it became Goodfellas. Others began to hire me in high-profile cases. A horse trainer named Buddy Jacobson, who had been involved in a famous murder in New York City, with an actress involved named Melanie Kane. And from there, I got involved with representing some of the New York Jets, including the All-Pro defensive end, Mark Gastineau, the quarterback, Kenneth O'Brien. And these cases propelled me further down the line into representing a narcotics case, a major case in the United States, the so-called head of narcotics trafficking in New York, Fat Cat Donald Payton. I won that case after a year and a half, after a 4-month trial. It made headlines, and in addition to that, the rumors of who I was circulated through the prisons, and I was getting cases all over the country, representing people all over the country, winning all over the country, and making enemies of the prosecutors who couldn't believe I was winning all the time. They concluded I had to be up to something wrong. The DEA dubbed me the Dark Prince of Harlem. I don't know why, but that was their view, and it boded not well for me. But then, in the 1990s, I had an opportunity to represent a young man who was a banker in Atlanta, involved in having lent billions of dollars to Saddam Hussein. And we won't go further into the details today, but as a result of that case, and in order to win for my client, I subpoenaed the President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, Henry Kissinger, and the National Security Advisor. The government folded after that and gave my client a good plea, and then 6 months later, he was poisoned and dead. So I thought that I had established myself, but instead I had upset people at the highest levels of our government. And this turned out to be a basis for the government deciding that I was a much more important target than any of my clients. And when the opportunity presented itself in 2008, they sent an informant to my office to speak to me and to my associates and claimed to be a friend of my client and in a position to help us locate witnesses. He was from Guyana, and in Guyana, they're lawless. Everybody seems to want to kill each other, and corruption is the name of the game in their judicial system. He thought the same was true here, and I tried to explain to him, you can't kill someone's mother here. The prosecutors interpret that to mean that I was authorizing him to kill anybody else's mother. In any event, I get prosecuted for my conversations with the informant, and after a 6-day trial and 7 days of jury deliberation, a lot longer, as you know, than the jury deliberated in Sean Combs's case, I was convicted, and the judge in the case sent me to prison for 14 years. So when I tell you that I can offer you a perspective of the criminal justice system that no one else can, that is the reason I say that. So let's talk a little bit today about how the government goes about making a case. They're not always the shining stars you see on TV, the FBI shows and the like. They actually do things that are improper often to be able to achieve results. And I'm reminded of a movie called And Justice for All, in which Al Pacino starred. And in the movie, there comes a point at the end of the movie, Pacino is defending a corrupt judge, and he finally turns around and he tells the jury, the prosecutor, and the judge presiding, you're out of order, you're out of order, the whole place is out of order. This whole system is out of order. Now, that's as good a description of the criminal justice system as I've ever heard, because that's the way it always seemed to me, and probably to all my colleagues. I'm not the first to say that the system is not about justice, and that may sound trite, but from one who has been a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and an inmate, I make that statement based upon 50 years of experience. The system is flawed, probably cannot be mended, because it depends on so many components and people to work correctly and in conjunction with one another, and they don't. In many cities, there are different unions that represent the police and the correction officers and the court officers, and they tend to clash over jurisdiction. Nonetheless, it's better than most systems, and we can tinker and make changes to make it better. Today, let's focus in on the manipulation of the system, though, by our prosecutors and our law enforcement personnel. Prosecutors and law enforcement, like FBI, like police, DEA, manipulate the system to win. Truth and justice is only applicable to Superman. In reality, it's all about winning, and they all have their motivations. Defense attorneys, make no mistake about it, are not much better than the prosecutors and or the law enforcement. They rarely put it on the line for their clients. Well, not unless they receive a big fat fee, and even then they may not go the extra yard. The function of a defense attorney is to go up to the line and do all you can for your client. Belly up to the line. You don't have to cross the line, but you should belly up and never walk away from the conflict. Never think of yourself, but think of the outcome for not only your client, but the system itself. Hard to find attorneys who do that. There was recently a case just concluded a few weeks ago in Brooklyn Federal Court of two women who were prosecuted for theoretically forcing people to provide labor for them. When I watched the case, I kept thinking about Pacino's line, everybody was out of order. The judge was out of order. The prosecutors were out of order. The jury was out of order. And nonetheless, screaming that in my own silence, I saw such an injustice being done. And let me tell you about the injustice from my perspective. First, they were charged with a statute that really was not intended to criminalize the conduct that they were charged with committing. There was an involuntary servitude charge created under federal law, which basically was in furtherance of the 13th Amendment, involuntary servitude. That's not what happened in this case, and was nowhere close to that. But before we get to the facts of the case, let me tell you how it came about. And by the way, either the prosecutors didn't understand the statute or didn't care what the statute said, which is probably more likely, and the judge certainly never seemed to understand the statute, or maybe didn't care as well. But that's how the case ultimately got to the jury. And it was a case about prosecuting two women for their philosophical beliefs, their First Amendment rights to express what they thought was a way to live. But we are not supposed to do that in America, but they did it there. Here's how this came about. In 2018, or thereabouts, a reporter for the Bloomberg chain, Ellen Hewitt, wrote a story about an organization called OneTaste. OneTaste was a sexual wellness community. You could voluntarily join, you could voluntarily leave. You could purchase courses to stay there, not only to learn about sexual wellness, but about many other different topics, sales, etc., life coaching. But Ms. Hewitt portrayed in her article a story about what apparently were dissatisfied former students of OneTaste. And there were about 35,000 students of OneTaste, and she found 2 or 3 who were unhappy. Whether or not at that point an FBI agent was in contact with Ms. Hewitt or not, or didn't become in contact with her until after the story was published, nonetheless, at some point, an FBI agent named McGinnis joined together with her and to create a understanding about how this case might be investigated. And 3 months later, she wrote a second story and said the FBI is investigating it. How she learned of that? I'm going to suggest it was Agent McGinnis, who saw this sexual case as a way to create a big case. I mean, sex was all in the news with regard to the Weinstein case and Me Too. It was a good case to look at for an agent. He went about doing this in so many improper ways that it's hard to list them all here. But I just want to give you an example, and then we'll go on to other parts of the case. And I have a person who's going to join us a little bit, who's going to talk about her interactions as a potential witness for the government with Agent McGinnis. So McGinnis was stalled in his investigation. Nothing was happening. The BBC did a broadcast. Netflix did a broadcast all about OneTaste. And we're not going to get too far into OneTaste today. That's a topic for another day because it's very involved. The government, particularly McGinnis, thought that the practices of OneTaste, their sexual freedom practices, and the teachings of Nicole Daedone and the actions of her head salesperson, Rachel Cherwitz, were unacceptable. I mean, that was a moral judgment, or really a legal judgment, but he made that judgment. And he began to become involved with certain people who, whether he understood they were misleading him or not, provided him information that led the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn to agree to pursue the investigation. So in 2017, the company, OneTaste, was being sold to new investors. And as part of a risk assessment process that was undergone by the new purchasers, they were trying to see if there were any liabilities that they should be aware of. As a result, they started gathering information of people who might say something negative about OneTaste. And that was acquired and ultimately hacked by a former employee of OneTaste and given to Agent McGinnis. Now, a good FBI agent should have locked the guy up right then and there, because that's a crime to hack other people's computers. But he didn't. Instead, when the fellow handed him documents that were stamped attorney-client privilege, he didn't do anything in conformity with the rules of the FBI. Their rules would say, hey, you have a document that might be privileged, you give it to what they call a taint team, T-A-I-N-T, so that they can review it and see whether or not indeed the materials are privileged. They don't want the agents who sees it to read it and act upon the information therein, because that violates the attorney-client privilege. But that's not what McGinnis did. He read it, and not only did he read it, he thought it was a script. So he went down the list of all the people who were on that list and started interviewing them. And of course, he was coming across people who did have a gripe against OneTaste. Whether valid or not, he had a basis to further his investigation. And among the people that he came in contact with was a woman named Aries Blank. And Aries Blank was a former staff member at one point and who had participated in OneTaste for a number of years. And she claimed that she had a journal that she had maintained while she was at OneTaste, and that she would turn that journal over if McGinnis wanted to him to review. Now, McGinnis had met her several years before and had a number of conversations with her. And at no point prior to the Netflix documentary coming out did she mention that she had a journal. Normally, any of us, not just a law enforcement person, would say to the person, Aries Blank, I'm sorry, we've been talking for a long time. Why is it you never mentioned to me that you had a journal until today, a couple of days after the Netflix documentary? But he didn't ask that question, or if he did, he didn't bother to record what her answer was. Well, one thing he did do was ask her for permission to be an editor of the document. Also a no-no. He didn't put it into the FBI custodian files so that they would have a copy of the document, seal it in an envelope, etc. As you know, chain of custody is a very important concept in law enforcement and for the courts. Instead, we don't know what he did or didn't do. I'll get you to the bottom line on the journal. After the two women were charged with an offense, that journal was litigated for almost 2 years. Nicole's attorneys, as Rachel's attorneys did, kept telling the judge and the prosecutors that the journals were fake, that they had been created after the fact, and maybe after the Netflix documentary. Whether it was created at that time by blank or by McGinnis or both, we don't know to this day. But after blank being the principal star witness for the prosecution for the upcoming trial, they then, on March 12th of this year, sent a letter to the court and said, we decided the journals may not be authentic, and we're not going to call Aries Blank as a witness. This is a perfect example of why there's a flaw in the system. Did it really take 15 motions addressed to the judge and to the prosecutors for them to finally get to the bottom of it? And what did they do to McGinnis? Nothing. Nothing happened. Nicole and Rachel complained to the Office of the Inspector General. Nothing happened. They complained to the head of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Nothing. Nobody would take responsibility for predicating a prosecution based upon a phony document and yet continue with the case. But that's exactly what happened. And here is really one of the most important things you should take away from today's episode. FBI agents, like all law enforcement agents, tend to manipulate this system and manipulate witnesses. And that's what they did here. They went back and spoke to people who had not been part of the organization, OneTaste, 10, 12 years. And they kept telling each of them, you're a victim. You're a victim. And they repeated this over and over again. And in addition to McGinnis telling them that they were victims, the other FBI agents on the case, I won't even mention their names, they're not worthy of it, kept telling all of them they were victims. And as part of this effort to make them understand that they were victims and create a new memory within them, we have videos of all of those times when those people were at OneTaste. I've seen them. And in reviewing them, I said to myself, these are happy, well-adjusted people who seem to be having the time of their lives. Now they all claim to be victims at the trial. How did this happen? Well, between the efforts of McGinnis to convince them that they were victims and the FBI's Office of Victim Services, people who were untrained in the field of psychology but who worked for the FBI, they also kept telling these women, you're victims. Oh, we feel so bad for you. You're a victim. And we're going to offer to potentially compensate you for all the suffering that you went through. Now, this is an incentive to people to get paid for saying I was a victim. And indeed, some of them did. Some of them may still get paid. Victimization. That's what the FBI and then the prosecutors on top of that started doing the same thing. They would meet, in some cases, 12, 14 times with these people. And they kept telling them that they were victims. One of them, I had listened to a podcast that they had been involved in back in 2012 or 13, somewhere in that period. And she talked about how she was such a sexual fiend that she began when she was a young teenager and continued up until the time she went to OneTaste and long after she went to OneTaste. But the prosecutors, the FBI, weren't interested in the fact that they were not victims. They were willing participants, but they turned them into victims, and they argued to the jury that they were victims, and ultimately the jury believed them, that they were all victims, but they were not. I want you to understand that these women, who the government ultimately put on the witness stand, were not the victims that were portrayed on the witness stand. And to do that, it's important for you to hear not from me, but from someone who went through the experience of being told they were a victim, but did not surrender their beliefs to the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office. So joining us today is Alicia Price, who was at OneTaste at one point in time and who was the subject of continual contact by the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office in an effort to make her a witness. So welcome, Alicia. And how are you today?
Hi, Robert. I'm doing well. It's good to be here.
So the setting looks good. You look good. So without further ado, tell the listeners about how you first came to know there was a federal investigation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the very first time that I came to know that there was an investigation, I had seen it in Bloomberg because they had done their article expose about OneTaste, and then a short time after that article came out, there was a short follow-up article that they did. It was an update that said that now a federal investigation was underway. I think that was 2018 or so.
I think November of 2018, I think that second article came out.
Yeah. And then I didn't hear much at all. I was not really in contact with too many people that would have been, impacted by it. So it wasn't super on my radar. I had heard some whispers of it, but I personally felt kind of removed from it. This was during the time period where there were still COVID restrictions, and I really didn't have the desire to get on a plane. All of it was a bit unsettling. And he said, yeah, if you don't show up, you'll be arrested and taken there by force, or you can step outside and talk to us right now. And I figure they came and had that, intentional approach, see if they could get me to talk rather than just saying, no, thank you, I have no desire to talk to you. And it worked. I did step outside and spoke with Agent McGinnis and Agent Sheehan.
So tell me what that conversation was like.
Oh, it was very, very unsettling. I felt like, kind of in a tough spot. I didn't really want to talk to them. I don't know that anyone ever feels good about the prospect of federal agents showing up at your door. And I felt scared. I felt like I wasn't sure what was going on. I felt a little bit pressed, and I felt it was that kind of like fearful, and then also underneath that it was like kind of fired up. Like I kind of tried to be like, okay, what's this about? What's going on? And what's the investigation? And I tried to ask them some questions, and basically I was like, what potential charges are you investigating? And they said, labor violations and sex trafficking. And And then I honestly, at the very start there, at the as soon as they said that, what flashed in my mind was, news clips that I had seen in the media about a case, of the Nixium group, and, they had, a decently high profile. They'd caught some headlines with that case. Federal case, and, specifically in the context of the, sex-related stuff. That was what the media had grabbed onto. And so, right when they said sex trafficking, I was like, "Oh, no, they're gonna try to turn this into something," meaning they're gonna try to turn, OneTaste into something like that. And, I kinda had this sinking feeling because I had this feeling like they had, set it in their sights, meaning these agents had really kind of decided what they were gonna do and were gonna, perpetrate, uh, kind of cutting and pasting anything that anybody said and turning it into something, that is just a specific narrative that they wanted to tell. That was what I thought immediately in that moment, and I had this strong sinking feeling. And, and then I said to them, I said, "You think that One Taste is like Nixium?" And I said, "Don't you? Is that what you think?" And they looked at each other and they looked at me and they shrugged and they said, "Yeah, we do." And I said, "No, it's not. It never was. I didn't have any experience like what I've seen in the media with that group, and that's not at all what we were doing." And I don't think they were too interested in my opinion and what I had to say. I told them that I didn't consider myself a victim in any way, shape, or form. And again, I didn't think that they were too interested in that. They were just looking to see what they could get me to say. Um, and then another thing that I strongly was feeling was, again, this was prior to any indictment. And so it was a kind of a combination of dread where I hear them saying, "We consider you a victim witness," but I was also well in a leadership position in the business. And so I thought, like, are they going to turn around and decide that I'm a criminal and charge me with something? How are they going to approach, getting what they want here? If I don't cooperate, is there a charge that is like some kind of non-cooperation? These are the things that are floating in my head, not knowing anything about the realities of federal investigation, but having, seen movies that basically, perpetuate the idea that the FBI has a very intense mystique of power and ability to do whatever it is they want to do and create whatever kind of story and pressure and manipulate people into doing whatever it is they want. And so I definitely felt quite an intense sense of dread in that moment. Kind of the fact that, okay, it doesn't matter what I say here, they're going to cut and paste and make whatever they want out of it.
So they're there for an hour, and then what happens? Or what other contact, if any, did you have with them?
Oh, I
Or the
did.
yeah.
Yeah, I had a good amount of contact over a period of about a year and a half. When they were preparing to leave, when they had heard enough, um, Agent McGinnis said, this was that first visit, um, had said, okay, we'll contact you again. And then he said, um, any devices that you have, any documents you have, any spreadsheets or anything like that, don't erase them. Don't get rid of them. We'll be confiscating your devices. And I told him, I said, I don't have any documents or anything. It's been 10 years since I worked for OneTaste. I didn't save any of that stuff. And he looked at me and he scowled and he was like, don't get rid of anything, in an intimidating way. And And then I thought, oh my gosh, are they gonna charge me with something? Am I going down here? And then I said, do I have a choice in participating? Because I had told them I don't consider myself a victim. And I said, do I have a choice in participating? And he looked at me and he said, no, you don't. And I believed him. Come to find out a year and a half later that was not true. I did have a choice, and I made a choice not to cooperate. But at that time, I felt extremely afraid and intimidated, and I had a subpoena in my hand. And then as they were walking away, they were like, "Don't worry about that subpoena." I mean, I still was kind of terrified that in 2 weeks' time, I might have a knock on my door and there'd be either more agents or, local law authority telling me that I needed to go to New York. So basically, in the morning, I set about trying to find an attorney. That in the first priority was to help me with the subpoena and help me understand what it was, and um, if it's still held, like basically like, are they gonna forget to say that it's not a it's like, I had to make sure that I wasn't gonna get arrested,
R-
basically.
Right, right.
But I felt like I needed someone to talk to because I was told I couldn't talk to anybody. It's, because OneTaste worked intentionally in the topic of sexuality, that in and of itself was like, you have to find the right therapist, right, who can even understand where you're coming from. But so I was like, okay, fine, let me talk to this. Um, Great. And I asked my attorney a bunch of questions about this victim specialist. Like, is it an agent? Is it like talking to the feds? Is it like speaking on record? And he was like, he kind of, again, he was just vague and good at soothing me, and said that no, they're going to help you find some resources. And, unfortunately, my experience so I ended up speaking to two different victim specialists. Again, the whole narrative is just to hammer you into being a victim, and identifying, like, kind of being pressured and pounded into feeling like the only narrative that I'm allowed to communicate through here is through the lens of me being a victim. And so I spoke to this victim specialist. This first one, his name was Bruce May, and he wasn't very responsive. He wasn't supportive. He was interested in me speaking to a organization that specialized in helping victims of sex trafficking, and that was his agenda. That was his motive of where he wanted to point me to. And I said to him, you know, I'm extremely upset right now. I lost my job and I'm extremely upset because of the way that I feel I'm being pressured by the FBI. I don't want to do this. And stone cold, this was over the phone, he responded and he said, you're upset. You're not upset because of what the FBI is doing to you. This is your trauma resurfacing from your time at OneTaste.
That's quite a statement.
And I just got this dead quiet. I just was dead quiet. And it was like the fog and the upset. I was just like, wow, these people are in no way interested in helping me or supporting me in any way. They're actually the perpetrators in uh, how they're behaving and how they're treating me and what they're insisting I do, and then in the narrative they're trying to fit me into. They're the ones kind of creating this, and they don't care a thing about me. They could care less about my mental state. The more upset I am, the better, as far as they're concerned. I felt so clear about that. I got off the phone with him and I never contacted him again. They wanted to set me up with, to talk to someone about sex trafficking. I never ended up doing that. I felt really pressed. And I felt extremely disillusioned and I hate to say it, but I did feel powerless in a certain way because they were like, yeah, you have no choice.
As I recall, there came a point where you may have written a letter to them.
I did.
Tell
Yeah.
us about that.
Yeah. So that was about at that year and a half point when I had started having those conversations with them through my attorney where they were, kind of trying to find a way for me to go to New York. And I was saying I wasn't willing. They were like, okay, well, we can have our first conversation over Zoom. They were making all these concessions. They even admitted that showing up, and ambushing me with a subpoena was an overreach and it was inconsiderate and not the right thing to do. They were making all these statements. I talked to a second victim specialist, and this is an interesting moment. I felt absolutely nuts. I can't I can't convey enough the degree to which I was freaked out about this entire experience and felt intensely pressured, and it was just consuming my thoughts for a good portion of the day every day after they had contacted me and said they wanted me to come to New York to do a deposition. And so I was like, I'm freaking out. I don't want to do this. And still like foolishly like working with that attorney. And he said, well, why don't we have you talk to another victim specialist? There's a woman that you can talk to. Her name's Angela. She typically works with like victims of mass shooting. I mean, just the intensity of the whole victim narrative that they're pushing was really intense. And so I was like, great, fine, I'll talk to her. And it was interesting when I finally got on the phone with this woman, Angela. She wasn't as hard as that other guy, Bruce May, was. And I was talking to her, and I basically was like in a panic. I was like, I really don't want to do this, but I know I have no choice. And I was kind of rambling. And I said that, and she was like, wait, what? And I said, I don't want to do this, but I'm being told I have no choice. And she was quiet for a minute. And all she said was to me, she said, that's not right. And I was quiet for a minute, and I was like, I know. And she said, okay, I'm gonna talk to, I don't remember who she said, but I'm gonna get back to you. And she said she was gonna like talk to the people in the department or whatever. And I got off the phone with her, and it was like that moment when she acknowledged that what was being done was not right. It was like it was that moment where it was like it broke the spell of coercion. And it was just that reality that I needed, and to really come out of feeling like I had no choice. And then I was just like so angry. It was like the anger that was coming up in my system, and I was so angry that the agents and the DA and my attorney was consuming so much of my time. It had impacted my career. It was impacting my relationship to friends and family. It was costing me money, and it was going to cost me more money. And it was like take, not caring about me, not I was just boiling over with anger. And so I think the next day, before I heard from anybody, the next day I wrote a letter to my attorney and to this particular victim specialist, Angela. And even though I had been told don't write anything in email or text at all, only do phone conversations, I had been told that by everybody. I really was like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do. I don't know if the feds are going to come after me. Again, there had been no indictment. It was that one of those hard moments where it's like, this is so wrong. I'm so angry. They're taking so much from me right now. They're consuming all of my attention. It's impacting everything in my life and insisting that I give my money over. And I was so angry. I said, okay, I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but I'm going to write a letter and tell them exactly how I feel. And I wrote that email and I sent it. And I said several things, and they were just pretty brutal. And I said, you can't possibly consider me to be a victim, or you wouldn't be treating me this way. And I said, gaslighting gets thrown around these days as a term, but this is genuine first class gaslighting that you're doing here. This is like old school Victorian shit right here. Like terrorize a woman and then say, there, dear, let's get you some help.
Well, it's how I think as we go further into this story over the next few episodes, we're going to, I believe, hear from other people who were in a similar position to you, who experienced the same thing. But at trial, and I've forgotten the number, but maybe 9 women got on the stand and said they were victims. They all, from what we know from the notes that the FBI and victim specialist Angela Jackson had with her texts and the like, every one of them went through the same experience you did.
Everything about the way they talked to me was to reinforce this idea that I was a victim. Every single word they used.
And yet, all these witnesses, as I was talking earlier before you came on, testified at trial about their terrible experiences at OneTaste, although we had video and podcasts and the like showing they had the time of their lives, as it appeared on the videos. But instead, at the end, the prosecutors argued to the jury, and the judge essentially charged the jury that it was okay to punish them for their philosophical statements. That is, Nicole Daedone and Rachel Cherwitz. In fact, during the summations by the prosecutors, they kept saying that everything that Rachel and or Nicole did spoke about their own experiences in life and how this is how it impacted them, but shouldn't necessarily impact you. This is my story, Nicole would say. The government summed up and they kept saying to the jury, everything that Nicole said, everything that Rachel did was not okay. That's the term that they used. And not okay, not okay, not okay. But we are in a system where it's supposed to be proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not whether or not it's okay or not. We don't punish people for their philosophical beliefs. And yet, the judge certainly felt similar to the prosecutors, or maybe she was an extra prosecutor. And when they were convicted on June 9, the prosecutors said, we have no interest in having them remanded, that is, placed in jail pending sentence. Then the judge said, okay, but I want to have a hearing the next day. And the next day we heard from the judge, and she went off on a tangent into talking about the newspaper articles that had appeared that were so negative to her, and negative about the witnesses, and negative about the prosecutors, negative about the charges. Well, ultimately, a court of appeals will decide whether or not these are valid charges. But this is a type of crime that was being brought, and you were to be part of that picture, of saying that people were forced to perform labor without sufficient compensation and without the ability to leave because their will was overborne by the teachings of Nicole Daedone. And the judge, notwithstanding the fact that the prosecutors didn't want them put into, or didn't have a desire to have them put into jail pending sentence, kept rambling on about the newspaper articles and talking about how Miss Daydone would look back at the gallery filled with her supporters, and that somehow that was not acceptable. And the judge wanted Cherwitz and Daydone to essentially denounce their philosophical beliefs. But of course they did not. I know to the listeners, they may think that this is made up, that it sounds more like the 1692 Salem witch trials. Or maybe like the priest talking to Al Pacino in the scene at the church in The Godfather, where he says to Pacino, do you denounce Satan? And Pacino, of course, says yes. Meanwhile, his people are out killing all five heads of the five families. I suppose if Nicole and Rachel had answered like Pacino and lied about denouncing their own prior philosophical beliefs, they wouldn't have been remanded. But she did, in fact, put them in prison, at least for the time being. I suppose she couldn't burn Nicole and Rachel at the stake, or like Pacino, have her enemies assassinated, but she ordered them held in prison until sentencing. And what you and I have been talking about is essentially part of the beginning of the witch hunt by agents and prosecutors who had a desire to win. And basically, that's part of the failing of the system. When it's all about winning, for an agent maybe to rise up in the ranks of the FBI or whatever law enforcement agency they're in, for a prosecutor, particularly federal prosecutors, to get a big victory under their belt and go back to their big law firm and get a partnership. It's or stay in the office and get a promotion. This was a case filled with such misconduct, initially by McGinnis, but continued by everyone. The prosecutors knew that he and the former employee had stolen by hacking attorney-client privilege documents. They didn't care. They defended his actions. McGinnis, I don't know. We'll see in the end of all this what happens with someone like him. I mean, he was a guy who resigned from the New York City Police Department in 2009 because he had been accused of an assault of a person he arrested. Nonetheless, he was good enough for the FBI. He was involved in the Nexum case where he's been accused of misconduct, and now here. So this is an interesting part of the process. How do we corrupt the system by corrupting the witnesses into believing what we believe and put them on the stand, and have created, by repetition to the witnesses, that you were a victim. And all that you're now recalling 10 years later is the memory from back 10 years ago. But it's not. It's an acquired memory. If you keep repeating to someone, I think you would say that's true.
For sure.
That you keep telling somebody they are a victim, and this happened to you, and Nicole did this, and Rachel did this, and you're going to create a witness who may not be lying, because that's their memory now. And that's the object of prosecutors and agents in all these cases. So I really appreciate you coming on today. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your experience here?
Yeah, so I appreciate you having me on. This is what happened, I think, is important to tell, even though it's unpleasant, but it is the truth. And I think it's interesting that, though, even from the start, from that first day that those agents showed up, I could see what it is they were seeking to do. And still, for a year and a half, it was such a sticky situation. I couldn't quite get myself out of it, um, even though it was like clearly having a detrimental impact in my life. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's from the inside, it's pretty clear what they were doing. And it was very sticky and difficult to navigate. And I think it's part of their playbook. And I think it's a travesty of justice, the very narrow, very highly agendaed, inaccurate narrative that was presented, you know, as evidence, in the actual trial, um, was so inaccurate to my experience of actually being an employee of OneTaste for 10 years. For almost 10 years, I participated and was an employee. And the narrative that the federal prosecution presented was not in any way representative of the reality of what I experienced and what I saw. And they, I think, had no desire to represent the truth in any way. And I think they have no desire to serve justice in any way. I think it's incredibly corrupt what they've done.
And just to put the dot on the I of what you're talking about, I mean, as I said at the beginning, this was a statute they were prosecuted under for involuntary servitude. Usually, this is a kind of situation where somebody brings someone over from overseas, takes their passport away, makes them work in their house, doesn't let them go anywhere, threatens them. That's what the statute's about. But that's not what was involved here. And yet they tried to make it sound like that to the jury, and successfully they convinced the jury to do that. So again, hopefully we advance the understanding of people of what the system is like by these kinds of programs, and we'll talk again. But thank you so much, Alicia.
Thank you, Robert. It's
All
good
right.
to be.
All right. So that's our story for today. Please come back and join us next week as we explore more injustice for all. This is Robert Simels saying good day.